Hi everybody, and welcome to a video on the concept and nature of God. This is an introduction to how one might think about God. So it's not necessarily going to give us any of the keywords to do with the various attributes that God has or give any key arguments. It's just going to look at the way in which this topic is discussed and the way that it's approached. There are going to be some keywords, but they're largely going to be to do with trying to making our work on logic and our terminology to do with how we talk about God a bit more precise and just make it a bit better. And it's also terminology that you can use anywhere in philosophy, your daily life, or whatever it may be. So let's have a look at the concept and nature of God. Well, what are we actually discussing then? Well, two things that we're discussing is obviously God's nature and the concept of God. Now, when we're talking about God's nature, we mean what God is actually like. And that doesn't necessarily always mean listing the various attributes of God that we'll see in a moment. Sometimes it can just be trying to point out what the fundamental nature or the fundamental essential being of God is actually like. So, for example, someone like St. Anselm says that God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. Now, that doesn't tell you any specifics. Likewise, when Descartes says that God is a supremely perfect being, it doesn't tell you any of the particular features that God has, other than whatever God is will be supremely perfect. It's almost as if whatever features God has will be the most perfect versions of those features. The concept of God then is also related to God's nature, because the concept of God is what the idea of God is. That means that what I'll be doing is talking about how we think about God, what attributes that we think God has, but also, even if I just say something like God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived, or God is a supremely perfect being, that is, when it's in my mind as a thought or an idea, is the concept of God. The two things are related though, because when I think about conceptualizing God, what do I think God is, that gives me a grounds to actually trying to explain whether or not God exists. I know what kind of thing I'm trying to prove the existence or non-existence of, for example. The other thing is that if we've got an idea of God's nature and what God's nature actually is, then this should help us to develop the concept of God. So God's nature should hopefully match whatever conception of God we have. You would hope that the concept of God matches God's nature in the same way that when I describe an object, that I hope that my description of the object matches the object itself in some way. So the two are interconnected with each other. But obviously one of the difficulties is that if there is a difficulty with the concept of God, not only does that make it very difficult to determine what God's nature is, it might also lead to the idea that maybe there is no being that matches that conception. And we'll be looking at that in some detail throughout the course. So one of the ways in which we understand God, God's nature, or the concept of God, is through Scripture. So it's about what has been written down throughout the ages about God. And we'll normally kind of think about those things in terms of things like the Torah and the Bible and the Quran as three examples. Three examples with good reason why I've picked those. There's also an element of what we call revelation. So some people believe that we understand God through revelation. That is, God reveals truths to us directly. And so the idea being that the writers of the Gospels kind of were given this information from God directly, so his word through their writings. However, certain philosophers and theologians actually engaged in theoretical philosophical discussions about the nature of God, and the depiction of God that they came up with became known as the God of classical theism. And these philosophers, of which there are many, came from traditions within Judaism, from within Christianity, and from within Islam. So this is why it gets called the God of classical theism, so the classical belief in a personal God. developed through these philosophical concepts, but also what's called the God of the philosophers. So it's those philosophers that were engaged in this sort of discussion, not just all philosophers, but those particular philosophers. The thing that we need to consider is what the God of the philosophers is meant to be like, or what the God of classical theism is meant to be like. And what you find among all these traditions is that there seems to be an agreement on the fact that God is omnipotent, that is, God is all-powerful. So there's this link to God's abilities, God being all-powerful. There's also a link to God's knowledge, so God being omniscient, that is, God is all-knowing. And then you'll often find the claim that God is supremely good, or what we call omnibenevolent. And then finally, there's normally some account of God's relationship to time, and that can be different depending upon the philosophy you're looking at. But there's a discussion to be had about whether or not God is everlasting, that is, does God exist within time, kind of passing through time at the same rate that we do, but didn't come into existence and won't go out of existence, so has kind of always existed and always will? Or is God not subject to time? Is God atemporal, kind of outside of being touched by the passage of time? So a discussion of the nature of God's relationship to time is also important. The point is that all these concepts should fit together. We should end up with some sort of coherent account of God. And what that means is that we don't run into any clashes with the things that we're saying about God. And those can take the form of what we call contradiction. They can take the form of incoherence. We might discover certain paradoxes within our understanding of God, and we can understand that it can lead to certain philosophical dilemmas. That's the stuff that I wanted to talk about today. Rather than talking about these key terms, let's just understand what we mean by things like contradiction and inconsistency, so we can understand how these arguments that we look at in the future are going to work. So let's include a brief but very important interlude here. The notion of negation. Negation is a logical function. Now, don't get panic about that. It's not going to get too mathsy or anything like that. All we mean is that we just add not to a proposition somewhere. So I've just picked Superman as an example here, just to keep it, I suppose, interesting. If I say something like Superman is a human, then if I negate that proposition, I make it into Superman is not human. Or we sometimes put it as it is not the case that Superman is human. This is the difference between proposition P and the proposition not P. Likewise, sometimes it doesn't always appear on the predicate. So here the subject is Superman and is human is the predicate, and we've negated the predicate is human by saying is not human. Sometimes it appears on what we call the quantifier, so the thing that tells you how many of something there are. So all superheroes wear capes is negated as not all superheroes wear capes. Now, the important thing here is that not all negations tell you something new. Some of them tell you something new, some of them don't. So if I were to say something like Superman is all powerful, I could negate that as Superman is not all powerful. Therefore, that you know that Superman has limits to his power, because being not all powerful means that you're not all powerful. It means that you're limited in your powers. That's because there's a direct negation there. Superman is all powerful, Superman is not all powerful. But sometimes it doesn't necessarily tell you anything. If somebody said Superman lives in Gotham City, he doesn't, he lives in Metropolis. But he lives in Gotham City, and you say Superman does not live in Gotham City, all that tells you is that Superman doesn't live in Gotham City. It doesn't tell you where he does live. So he could live in Metropolis or New York, or he could live on the moon or anywhere. So sometimes negation just tells you that the first bit is false, and that's all it does. It just says Superman doesn't live in Gotham City. And other times you can actually use that to imply something further. So Superman isn't all powerful actually tells you that he's going to have limits to his powers. He's not going to be able to do everything. So once you've understood the idea of negation, we can then start thinking about how that links to discussing God. So one of the first things we could ask is whether or not the concept of God is somehow contradictory. when we talk about a contradiction, we're being very strict on what we mean. We mean it's the relationship between P and not P. That is, not P contradicts P, and P contradicts not P. That is, we don't want to say the opposites, because opposite is a clumsy term, but one is the negation of the other, right? So you couldn't hold both of those beliefs at the same time. You couldn't believe P and not P at the same time. So, for example, you couldn't believe that Superman is all powerful, but Superman is not all powerful at the same time, right? Now, self contradiction would be where P entails its own negation. So the thing that negates P, not P, is already a part of P itself. Here's a simple example. If I just say something like Superman is a married bachelor, that contains its own negation, because the word bachelor means unmarried, and married then is the negation of unmarried. So you get bachelor and married clashing with each other and causing a self-contradiction. So you can have separate propositions that contradict each other. Superman is all powerful, Superman is not all powerful. Or you could have self-contradictory propositions. Superman is a married bachelor. What we're interested in is whether or not the concept of God could contain any contradictions. Are there any things in our definition of God, our concept of God, that either butt up against each other in that sense of being contradictory, or which entail their own internal contradictions? Now, this one gets a bit more complicated, I think, which is the idea of consistency. What we mean by being consistent or inconsistent. Now, claims are consistent if they can be asserted at the same time without one showing the other to be false. That is, that one doesn't contradict the other somehow. But as we saw before, sometimes you can have two claims that you can't hold at the same time, but that doesn't mean that the one is just a straightforward negation of the other. So where we said P, not P, it might be that the claim is something like P and Q, but you can't believe Q at the same time as P, right? Now, the way to understand this is to go a little bit back to where I said that sometimes kind of a negative proposition doesn't tell you anything positive. So if I say something like Superman doesn't live in Gotham City, that doesn't tell me where he does live, right? But if I knew where Superman did live, then that would tell me that he didn't live in Gotham City, and therefore somebody that said he did live in Gotham City would be contradicting that claim, right? So we're kind of working in a different direction. So what I could say is that there is a clash between believing that Superman was born on Earth and that Superman was born on Krypton. And the reason being that if Superman was born on Krypton, then he wasn't born on Earth, which means that that would be inconsistent with believing that he was born on Earth, right? But notice how if I just said Superman was not born on Earth, it doesn't tell me whether he was born on Krypton or whether he was born on Mars or Jupiter or born in the middle of space on a spaceship. It doesn't tell me any of that. The point is that while it may not appear to be a straightforward case of P, not P, the point is that I'm saying P and Q, but Q entails within it not P, or it leads to not P. So inconsistency is not exactly the same as contradiction. Not born on Earth contradicts born on Earth, and Krypton is inconsistent with born on Earth. So born on Krypton is inconsistent with born on Earth because it entails not being born on Earth. Okay? This is just a point of precision, that you don't want to say that everything contradicts everything else, because contradiction is a very strict relation, and it's sometimes worth talking about being consistent. Likewise, just as a final point, try not to confuse being consistent with being directly inferred from. So, for example, two claims can be consistent even though they're completely detached from each other. Like, for example, Superman is a superhero and there is a cup on the table. What makes those claims consistent is I can believe both at the same time without one showing the other one to be false, right? So without one negating the other. You might say, yes, but what does there being a cup on the table have to do with Superman? Nothing. I can just believe both at the same time. So P and Q can be perfectly consistent with each other, regardless of what their content is. They could be about two completely different subjects. They become inconsistent when either P or Q entail something which would make the other one false. So there you go. That's the difference between contradiction and inconsistency, and also something to watch out for when you're talking about things being consistent. Which leads us to a bit of a discussion about paradoxes. We're not going to spend too long worrying about paradoxes in terms of going through loads and loads of examples, but you can get down quite a rabbit hole when you're looking at paradoxes, when you're like looking at them on the internet and you find all these obscure logical problems. A paradox is where you use a form of reasoning that begins with a perfectly reasonable claim, or something that seems reasonable enough. There's nothing to suggest that it's absurd, but leads to absurd, illogical, or self-contradictory conclusions. There are different types of paradoxes that we find, but what we don't want to end up with is a paradox, because it shows a kind of like a deadlock in our reasoning. It shows that there's a flaw in our reasoning. So we want to avoid paradoxes where possible. Paradoxes are really useful for philosophers, by the way, because if you've ever read anybody's paradoxes, Russell's paradox, for example, the whole point is not to show that reasoning doesn't work. It's meant to show a problem with reasoning that needs to be thought out and unpicked so that the paradox can be avoided, right? So it actually helps us develop our logic. It's like finding anomalies in science. So here's an example of a paradox. Imagine you've got a person with a full head of hair. If you removed one hair from that person's head, would the person then be bald? And the answer is probably no, they wouldn't. So let's remove another hair from their head. Would that person then be bald? The answer would be no. All you've done is removed now 2 hairs. Now the thing is, I could do this process forever. I could just keep picking single hairs off this person's head until eventually there's no hair left. But at what point do they become bald? Now, the picture here is of a person who is clearly bald, but is it evident at what point in time, how many hairs they would have to lose before they became bald? And then if I kind of plucked a hair off their head and you arbitrarily said, okay, now they're bald, does that mean that if I put the hair back, that suddenly they're not bald anymore? While we can clearly see the difference between people that are bald and not bald, there doesn't seem to be a clear dividing line between the two. And so what the paradox shows us is that we have these clear-cut definitions of what counts as somebody having a full head of hair or being not bald, and people being bald, that is P and not P, P being bald being not P. And yet, through a series of perfectly reasonable claims about removing one hair at a time, I don't seem to be able to ever find the point where P becomes not P, and yet there's clearly a difference between the two. Perfectly logical reasoning, and yet leading to the most absurd conclusion, that the person could never become bald by removing one hair at a time. It's an odd one, that, but these are the sorts of things that you have to worry about. If you're producing concepts of things like God that rely upon multiple parts, are there paradoxes concerned with any of the concepts that we're using? And finally, as demonstrated here by Homer Simpson, does the concept of God lead to any dilemmas? A dilemma in this scenario is going to be more to do with reasoning and truth than it is necessarily about kind of our moral dilemmas that we have. So remember, we talk about moral dilemmas, we talk about whether or not I can resolve an issue where neither of the things that I could choose would be good. So you might talk about in Kantian ethics or something like that, about whether or not it's possible to have moral dilemmas. Are there situations where telling the truth leads somebody to die, but saving the person leads you to having to lie? And the fact that's a dilemma that Kant might have to deal with. The point is that neither choice is a good one. This is the idea, is that a dilemma, you don't like either of the choices, or both of the choices are immoral, or both of the choices lead to suffering, or something like that. Here we're basically talking about are there any places when we're looking at God where we have a choice to make? What we call the horns of a dilemma. So that's a key word for you to think about, the horns of a dilemma, where you can pick A or B, but picking A leads to some sort of inconsistency with our idea of God. It doesn't tie in with our idea of God neatly, maybe causes a contradiction or something like that. But then you go to the other one and say, okay, well, not A, I'll have B then. But B also leads to an inconsistency or a contradiction. This means that neither point is one that you're happy to concede. You've got to, by accepting one thing about God, you've got to reject another. And sometimes that's not just a straightforward case of there's an outright contradiction here. It's, well, there is a solution, but that solution is just as bad. This can very often happen in morality, but it also happens when we're doing conceptual work, that we end up with logical inconsistencies. Notice, though, that this isn't the same as a paradox. A paradox is just that the reasoning leads to an absurd conclusion. This is one that says that it doesn't matter which choice out of the two you pick, out of some choices about how to reason about this, they both lead to some sort of inconsistency or contradiction. So let's piece it all together. We've talked about the God of classical theism being omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent, and either eternal or everlasting. And we've also looked at ideas like contradiction, inconsistency, paradox, dilemma. And the point is that these might emerge out of the various things that we say about God, whether or not ideas like omnipotence can coexist with other features of God, other attributes of God, without causing inconsistency, whether or not some of those concepts are self-contradictory or paradoxical, for example. If those issues can't be resolved, then it suggests that there's not just something wrong with the concept of God, that is, we can't conceptualise God properly. It can also then be the case that there's something wrong with the nature of God, that God itself would not be coherent, that the features of God cannot coexist together. And therefore, if your idea is of the God of classical theism, and that there is a being that has those features, then either we're unable to reason about those features coherently, or reason about God in general coherently, but also it raises questions about God's coherence and therefore existence. That is, there is no God that matches those features, because there couldn't be a God that matches those features, because those features would be contradictory or inconsistent in some sense. That's our starting point. What do we mean by the classical God of classical theism? What do we mean by contradiction, inconsistency, paradox, dilemma, all that sort of stuff? And we're going to start by looking at some of the attributes of God as we go along, and then thinking about some issues that might be raised. So there you go, the concept and nature of God.